Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Robbie Knock, and I'm the Director of Entrepreneurship and Professional Practice here at ArtCenter College of Design, and you are joining us for Capture This, the first Capture This session, which is part of our Creative Tech Week at ArtCenter. We have three in this series as part of the week of programming for ArtCenter that are addressing the future of communication, technology, and language. And I will introduce our moderator, Gloria Kondrup. Gloria is our Executive Director of the Hoffmitz Milken Center for Typography and the Archetype Press. She's a professor of practice and of graphic design and is an alum of ArtCenter and a real visionary at the intersection of design, technology, and business. So she will introduce the rest of the panelists this morning, and we're very glad to have you here. Thank you, Gloria, for hosting us and for supporting this effort with the Hoffmitz Milken Center.
It's my pleasure to be part of Creative Technology Week here at ArtCenter, especially because we are so involved in the platform that studies linguistic trends that are born within these communication platforms, the transformative effects that technology has on our use of languages, and what these occurrences reveal about the future of communication. So today, I want to invite you to meet two poets, Alison Parrish and Sam Creely. Allison is a computer programmer, poet, and educator, and game designer who addresses the unusual phenomenon that happens when language and computers meet. She is an assistant arts professor at NYU in the interactive communication telecommunications program, where you earned your master's degree. Allison, thank you for being here. And Sam Creely, who is also a poet, editor, bookmaker, an educator, and his work engages anti-colonial queer methodologies, turning syntax against institutional systems of logic and sense. And he currently is an assistant professor in our graduate media design program practices at ArtCenter College of Design. And today they're going to talk about language. One might talk more about visual languages and how it transcribes into the digital, and another one will talk about the intersection of our written languages and the computer and computational effects on our languages as poets and as transcribers of this as poetry. So Sam, I don't know if you'd like to start and talk about your project. Very interesting project. Sam and I found that we have a lot in common. Sam really examines the effects of technology and the transcription of visual language. And I'll let Sam talk to you about the kind of projects that he's currently involved in. So Sam?
Sure, happy to. Thanks for having me, Gloria. So hello, Sam Creely. I teach in graduate media design at ArtCenter. My work tends to focus on how systems of language become systems of thinking. Given the theme of this panel, poetry's relationship to computation and transcription, the project I wanted to zoom in on is called Dance Notes. And it's a collaboration between myself and another poet, Pia Cezanne. It started out as a bit of a side project, but has grown through a summer research residency at ArtCenter. Foremost, it is a publication project where Pia and I serve as editors of a chapbook series that publishes experiments in dance notation. We also co-authored the first volume, which I'll present in a minute. Dance Notes is also a method of interpretation of close reading for gesture that we hope others can take up for their own notational experiments. As a method, Dance Notes operates at a junction between performance studies and documentary poetics. Documentary poetics, for those unfamiliar, is a genre of poetry that engages the archive, historical documents, or exists somehow in relationship to a specific referent. And it has developed alongside an ethical concern with the ways that documents abstract the lives of the subjects they encounter. On the other hand, contemporary performance theory has a similar set of anxieties, particularly when it comes to dance, about the transcription of moving bodies in writing occurring at the expense of ephemeral knowledge. So again, we're sort of working at the crossroads of these two fields because we think they have something to say to each other. To back up a bit, dance notation is historically unsuccessful. Unlike music notation, which has an accepted, agreed upon system, for dance, there are a few existing models. Probably Laban notation is the most famous. In just a second, I'm gonna quit Slack so those notification sounds don't pop up again. Yes, so Laban notation is probably the most well-known system of dance notation. There's also Butoh and Fourier notation, as well as contemporary practices of using motion capture and similar technologies to try to document dance. But where there's a clear iconography for music notation that we all have access to, there isn't really an intuitive visual go-to when it comes to dance. That interests me. Why has nothing caught on? What is it about gesture and language and mechanization that don't really tend to coexist or cohabit space happily? To be clear, Dance Notes as a project is not trying to find the system that works. Rather, it leans into that unsuccessful relation in order to ask questions about language and abstraction, while hopefully resisting an easy ideological divide that frames notation and transcription as purely violent and mechanical on one side, and on the other privileges poetry as the thing that speaks the language of the unspeakable or the unexplainable. So when my collaborator Pia and I began our first experiment of this nature, we turned to the work of choreographer Anna Teresa de Keersmaeker. Those familiar with de Keersmaeker's work know that her choreography tends to be very systematic. She creates a lexicon of gestures with her dancers and more or less sets it on shuffle to see how those patterns fall in and out of sync with each other across dancers, or in and out of phase, as she calls it. This seemed like a logical starting point for such a project. But when researching this particular dance called Come Out from 1981, further, we found that it had a curious history. So it was choreographed in 1981 as part of a larger work called Fasa, which was 4 dances choreographed to 4 different Steve Reich songs. The stated goal of this piece was to think about the relationship between music and dance. One of the 4 Steve Reich songs choreographed was called Come Out, which is this dance. And Come Out, Steve Reich composed in 1966, and it was commissioned for a benefit that was meant to raise funds for the retrial of the Harlem Six, who were 6 young Black men who were arrested in the wake of the Harlem Little Fruit Stand riot of 1964 for a murder to which there remains no proof of their connection. Reich's track features a 4-second audio clip on loop, spoken by Daniel Ham, one of the 6, during an interview with civil rights activist Truman Nelson. So if we pause there and consider this context, and then sort of arc back to de Keersmaeker, watching this dance, it seems to have, to say the least, very little to do with the Harlem Six. So how did that happen? How did we get here? Through a sequence of translations, transcriptions, and iterations that moved steadily away from the lives and experiences and historical contexts of the people that these works addressed. 70 hours of taped interview became 4 seconds, became a song, became dance. Now, to be clear, I'm not advocating for medium purity or coming out against translation. There may be modes of mediation that estrange us from context, just as there are modes of remediation that aim to recover context. But I'm interested in how this dual process works. So to share the co-authored chapbook called Throat Draw, Come Out With It, and just sort of our methods for approaching this, we began with a roughly 2-minute clip of this dance that we notated 3 different times using 3 different strategies. And I'll just sort of go through this quickly, but you can see some of the work on the page. The first method is the most robotic. It's the most mechanical. We tried to account for every single gesture in this 2-minute clip of the dance, and the way that each of these gestures across these two dancers sort of fall in and out of sync with each other. The second method, we tried to capture a sense of interiority or subjectivity. The lyric I comes into play here. And we tried to interpret each gesture as if it were miming some sort of practical or knowable quotidian activity or gesture. And the third method I like to call a failed essay in 3 parts, which proceeds by a series of research questions that all interrupt each other and fragment each other as we're sort of grappling with a lot of the questions and critiques we have of this dance, of notation, of abstraction, etc. In notating this dance, our goal was twofold: to frame notation as the thing that negotiates proximity to context, and to produce a notational poetics in order to understand notation as an art form in and of itself. Proximity to context does not mean that everything needs to be said or that nothing may remain unsaid. Otherwise, what we would have is not contextualized writing or contextualized art, but merely context alone. In inhabiting a relation to proximity, the interpretation of a dance, for example, becomes governed by a variety of factors irreducible to each other. And I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. I think we'll return to this and put it in context with the work of Allison, and you'll see the similarities between perhaps process or contextualizing information. It's very interesting. For those of you, I think we'll talk more about it. It's Sam and I found we did have some similarities, that I was one of the few people he's met here at ArtCenter who studied dance notation.
Specifically Lava notation, which takes a lot of
I studied Lava notation in another past life, guys. That's a whole nother life. But now let's look at the work of Allison first before we get into our discussion. Now, Allison, I'm going to invite you to share with us, thank you, some of the very interesting work that you've done with computational poetry and your process and your philosophy about why this is an area of study for you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak, Gloria, and thank you, Sam, for that super fascinating and informative presentation about the chapbook, which I read in preparation for this, but I didn't know all of that context, so it was super helpful. So I'm going to make use of my time in a slightly different way. From Sam. Instead of talking about one project in depth, I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of projects in no depth at all. Just kind of like a longitudinal introduction to a bunch of different projects that I've made. So that will hopefully be a good starting point for the discussion. So I want to start by talking about this project that I made when I was a grad student, actually, starting back in 2007, called Every Word. So this is a Twitter bot, a program that posts to Twitter on a regular schedule. And the goal of the Twitter bot was to tweet every word in the English language. Thus the name Every Word. So this project ran from 2007 to 2014. It's now been just as long since it ended from when it started, which is weird. And over the course of 7 years, it went through a word list and tweeted every word in that particular word list. Along the way, it got around 100,000 followers, which doesn't seem like that much for a Twitter account nowadays, but 100,000 followers for a experimental writing Twitter bot is kind of a big deal. And it got a lot of press when it was coming to an end. So there was a lot of discussion about the end of every word, like what would the last word that every word tweet be? And like, people from CNN were calling me up and asking me this question. All of my friends were discussing it, staying up late that night to find out what would happen, what the last word of every word would be. So the thing that actually happened is a little bit confusing. And I actually think definitely plays into the issues that we might want to talk about today. So it's treating every word in alphabetical order. So what was happening is it kept on going through words like zymogen, zymogenic, zymolysis, zymosis, zymotic, zymergy, and then it tweeted eclair, which was a surprise to a bunch of people. I think you don't think that eclair comes after zymergy, and I would, if you click through to the replies on this, is just a bunch of people performatively expressing shock at the fact that this has happened. The reason that it tweeted zymergy and then eclair is that computers represent letters as numbers, right? And when you're sorting something alphabetically with computer, the easiest way for it to do it is to sort it numerically. And it happens that the letters in the alphabet are in numerical order in the representation systems that computers use as well. But the letter E with an accent on it is different from the letter E without an accent. It has a different number assigned to it. And it so happens that the number assigned to the letter Z is 122, whereas the number assigned to the letter E with an accent is 233. So according to the computer, it comes afterwards. So this list was sorted in that particular order. And then it did this like extremely weird thing. I still think that probably 99% of the people that were following the bot in 2014 still have no idea why it switched to E with an accent, why it tweeted eclair. And then the final word was actually etui, which is like a small pouch. So this is like, well, maybe I can click through to some of the reactions here. There might be some weird language on here for this. Oh no, I don't want to reply to it. I want to see the responses. Well, maybe I can't. My computer is so weird when I'm presenting on Zoom, but you can click through that and you can take my word for the fact that a lot of people were surprised. My interest with Twitter bots continued after that, and I made this Twitter bot. I'm actually showing the Tumblr version of it. Once you have a Twitter bot, it's easy to make a Tumblr version. This is a bot called the Ephemerides. This bot tweeted very small computer-generated poems in juxtaposition with images that are sourced from a public database of images from outer planet probes. So like Voyager 2, Cassini, probes like that that visited the outer icy planets. And it's drawing from like two minor texts that are in the public domain that are about oceanography and astrology, putting those together by recombining their grammatical constituents at random. So you get interesting little tidbits, like the cold experience by the simple natures of these substances is terribly intense, paired with this particular image. This had about 5,000 followers, which is less than every word, but for a science fiction poetry bot, kind of a pleasing amount of followers. Not that I evaluate my work based on the number of followers, but it's just one way to think about whether or not something is resonating on the internet. Along with Adam Simon and Tim Satella, I designed a word game called Rewordable. This was in 2016. We put it on Kickstarter, raised a bunch of money, and it was eventually published by an imprint, Penguin Random House. You can buy it on Amazon now if you want to. So this is a card game that is also a word game that's sort of a response to Scrabble. So the problem that I have with Scrabble is that it encourages a certain kind of play because it's based on single letters that are scored by by letter frequency, and that letter frequency is, inversely related to obviously how common that letter is. The score is inversely related to how common the letter is. Scrabble as a game encourages you to memorize those really short words like za and chi, those short 2-letter words that you play on triple word scores to get really big points. It doesn't actually encourage you to exercise your full linguistic capability as like a speaker, writer, and reader of English. So Rewordable is designed to fix that problem with Scrabble. And the way that we did it is by putting multiple letters on every card instead of a single letter like you do in Scrabble. And then all of the cards are scored equally. There's no like extra points for more rare letters or anything like that. So the end result of that is it encourages you to make like longer, more satisfying words instead of the people who've memorized those short, high-scoring words being the ones that win by default. So that's like the game design part of my practice. I've been interested in the line as a unit of poetry, especially like one of the defining characteristics of poetry is that it's divided up into lines. Lines as a unit of text are kind of like a totally constructed arbitrary thing. So it's kind of interesting from that perspective to consider lines as like their own culturally situated practice. As part of that general research, I made this tool called Gutenberg Poetry Autocomplete. So what this does is it takes a big database of every line of poetry in Project Gutenberg. Project Gutenberg, if you're not aware, is a database of texts that are in the public domain in the United States, mostly in the English language. They're in the public domain, which means they were published before 1924, which sort of like limits the authors that are included, because the authors that were included in published text up until that point are also very limited. But what this tool does is that you can type in any, I don't know what I'm typing here. I used to, you can type in any text and then it shows you all of the lines of poetry that begin with that line of text from Project Gutenberg, searching this 2.8 million line thing. I wrote this originally as a tool for my students to make autocomplete poetry because I didn't want them to have to use Google if they didn't want to. This project evolved into a book of mine called Articulations that was published in 2018 by Counterpath Press. This book is lines of poetry collected from Project Gutenberg that have been arranged according to their phonetic similarity. So I wrote a machine learning model that went to every line of poetry in this corpus of poetry and assigned it essentially a number, a vector that was a compressed representation, like a compressed version of the phonetic content of that line of poetry. And then to compose this text, and this is the PDF of it here, to compose this text, it selected a line of poetry at random and then followed that by the line of poetry that was most similar to that phonetically, and then followed that with a line of poetry that was most similar to that phonetically, and so forth. And you end up with a text. I won't have time to read a whole bunch from it, just give you a flavor. It goes, the setting day, a snake said, it's a cane, it's a kill, is like a stain, like a stream, like a dream. And like a dream, sits like a dream, sits like a queen, shine like a queen, win like a flash, like a shell, fled like a shadow still, lies like a shadow still, I, like a flash of light, shall I, like a fool, quoth he, you shine like a lily, like a mute, shall I still languish, and still I like Alaska. So it's this like combined these lines of poetry associated by their phonetic similarity creates this particular interesting effect. That line of research ended up in me thinking more about machine learning representations of sound in language, and especially thinking about nonsense words, like words in Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll is a good example of a poem that primarily depends on words that are made up for a particular purpose to achieve a particular end from an aesthetic standpoint, not necessarily from a semantic standpoint. That research ended in this project that I made for Google Arts and Culture called the Nonsense Laboratory. I have a little video of it here, where I made a machine learning model that can spell English words and then sound out English words according to their like a phonetic transcription of those words. And then made this series of tools that lets you kind of like in this interface poke at the different underlying phonetic properties of words, and then it automatically respells them for you. With various different like playful interfaces that let you, for example, in this case, respell particular words to have the same sounds but emitting particular letters, or sequencing together words sort of like as a drum machine that's activating different parts of the vocal tract, and so forth. That research also is what led to this series of poems called Compasses. I know I'm out of time, so this will be the last thing, where I choose these different words on the outside, and then a machine learning model invents words that combine the words that are adjacent to it on the diamond. So for the cardinal directions, you get this new poem: north, earth, east, siwit, south, west, west, worth, earth, for a combination of things like the elements. You get earth, air, fair, fire, where, water, warth, hair. So that's a bunch of my work. Thank you for giving me an extra 2 minutes to go through that, but that's what I've got.
Thank you, thank you. We're going to, I mean, what I find very interesting is the complexity of the conversations that you're both having, you know, with your decisions based upon what you're creating. I mean, for instance, Allison, you create the algorithms, or Sam, you're creating a notation project, and how you arrange the page or what you decide to include. How do you make those decisions about what to include, or what to direct the machine, or what to direct what you decide to include? And how is your culture or ethics or ethnicity influencing these decisions? Are these something you think about?
Yeah, I don't know if you want to start, Sam, or I should start.
Sure, yes. I mean, I think when it comes to my own research, studying medieval linguistics, and looking at sort of the transmutations of language over time, the thing that guides my decision-making there is trying to establish grammar and syntax as cultural artifacts, right? They're not just arbitrary rules. They are things that a lot of people have agreed upon, that this is the correct way to utter something so that it makes sense or is logical. But thinking of them as sort of artifacts that express their histories is sort of my main decision factor. And that's where I can put in some sort of, try to develop an anti-colonial politics or an anti-colonial poetics, or a queer poetics, in sort of taking these rules, understanding them for what they are, but then trying to twist them in productive ways.
Yeah, I'm the question of like where you get your data and what you do with it is kind of at the forefront of arguments about ethics in machine learning right now. And the trend at the moment is for researchers in machine learning to simply appropriate data from different places. And their legal argument, so if you're looking at like big trendy language models like GPT-2 and GPT-3 that are produced by big companies like OpenAI and Microsoft and Google and stuff like that, their legal argument currently is when we make a machine learning model out of it, even though we don't own the data, we do own the artifact that results from the machine learning process, and we own the output of the machine learning model, right? Which I think is like just nonsense. It's an appropriation of the commons on a scale that is really, I want to say unprecedented, but we have some pretty awful, very precedented appropriations of commons in the history of the world and of this country in particular. But it's pretty egregious. I have recently been trying to be very, try to provide a positive example of a computer-generated arts practice that does not engage in that particular kind of appropriation. So like in all of the projects that I've shown here, I've only used data sets that I'm like at least legally entitled to use. Like Project Gutenberg is in the public domain, which means that this stuff has been designated by law as being part of the commons. So I don't really feel bad about using that. I make use of this thing called the CMU Pronouncing Dictionary, which is also not in the public domain, but licensed in such a way that it's available for anyone to use. So that's like a big important part of my practice, is like trying to find those sources of data that let me use them on this sort of that let me use these like large scale methods on them, while sticking to just the things that are like available to me. The flip side of that, as I mentioned when I was talking about articulations, is that if you're looking at data sets that are in the public domain, you're looking at data sets that are published before 1924. If you look at the kinds of people whose work was published before 1980, before 1924, is really, really limited in terms of its, representation of different kinds of people.
Especially today, in the context of today, Yeah. Sam, do you find, because you're working in your notation and your translations, aren't you working with actual choreography and visual communication that exists today? I mean, how do you deal with what your decisions are made based upon using someone else's work who's currently working?
Yeah, I mean, there I sort of dip into the poetic technique of ekphrasis, which is has a very long history, but it at its core is poetry about an aesthetic object, describing an aesthetic object, and sort of, like Ode on a Grecian Urn is a classic example of this. But as a contemporary poetical practice, it sort of has more recently been recuperated for minoritarian poetics, as a way to sort of talk back to whatever is being described. And I think a lot of the logic behind that has to do with the way that Allison is talking about algorithms, or the way that, like, in MDP at ArtCenter, we talk about algorithms as not being neutral, right? That there's someone still creating the rules and making decisions at the highest level. So having an awareness of that and sort of using, that knowledge specifically in how you describe or relate to what you're describing.
It's interesting too, Allison, in talking about the use of algorithms, or the way that the computational aspect of what you're doing is becoming the trademarkable aspect of this. You're not these larger companies or anyone, they're not addressing content as much as they're addressing, okay, it's the software that makes this legitimate, and you're able to say, well, we're really not compromising content because we're creating, like you said, something new for this. I mean, it's a very strange way to approach language and communication when you put it back into the technology and said, well, we're not really appropriating, we're not using a source, or we're using technology, and somehow they're removing, do you feel if technology is being removed from the context of the language where it shouldn't be?
Well, that's the grift of machine learning, right? Is to try to remove responsibility from the person who's producing the output of the model to make it seem like it's objective, right? And this is like something that people have been trying to pull with machine learning for many, many years. And it's definitely a fever pitch right now with people pulling that grift with this technology. And it's awful, it sucks. And like having my work associated with that kind of thing is actually really depressing and difficult to deal with on a day-to-day basis, because that's not my goal. I'm not trying to create some kind of like or poetry that has no source, that's like the machine speaking back to us, right? I'm trying to make my poetry that comes from my aesthetics, that has my political goals, right? Which are served in many cases by these computational methods, right? It's a tool that I can use to accomplish these other things. It's not an argument that I'm making about, the nature of language or the singularity or any of that other garbage. But yeah, that's like with something like something like autocomplete on your phone is actually like a really great example of this, where you are given the next word to type, right? But they don't tell you who's speaking that word, right? They're literally putting into your mouth the result of this machine learning output. But that results from, those suggestions result from a machine learning process that's trained on a data set that includes many different voices from many different people, that includes like your own voice used in ways that maybe you aren't aware of, right? But it's scrubbed of all authorship. It's scrubbed of all context. It's scrubbed of all the history of the labor that went into that word being associated with that particular context, right? And that's, I think that's bad. I don't think that people should do that. Which isn't to say that like autocorrect or autocomplete as a technology is bad. But I think the way that it's trained and deployed is bad. But yeah, that's why I try to be like explicit about where I get my data from and about the process by which the outputs are produced from that data.
How are your students, and this is a side question, how do your students approach this, or how do you approach the subject matter with students, who are maybe, do you have art and design students? Do you have engineering students? How do you find your students are reacting to what you're doing in your projects? I'm curious.
I mean, speaking from my perspective, I'm actually super interested in Sam's answer to this question too. I have a combination of arts and design and engineering students. I have pretty much 0 students who come to my classes who are interested in creative writing as a genre, and that's just a property of where I happen to teach and the circumstances of my program. So like, I mean, a lot of students in arts, design, and engineering are approaching this material from the perspective that is dictated to them by companies like Google and Microsoft and OpenAI or whatever, where it is sort of this like, well, obviously the future is that machines will take over these jobs of creative expression, and we're going to help that work along, right? Or I'm going to find some commercial application for this. And the goal of this technology is to create artifacts that have a certain verisimilitude to artifacts that are created by other means, like more traditional human authorship, right? And so I have to kind of like, part of my work as an instructor is like walking them back from that and saying like, well, what is actually happening here? Let's adopt a critical stance toward it. Think about what language actually does, what it actually means, what people can actually do with it. And then I look at this material in the context of experimental writing practices in the past and look at it as like an actual experimental writing practice along the lines of, we were talking about earlier, Gertrude Stein. Like another big touch point in my class is Nervese Phillips' song. Thinking through like the Oulipo and Fluxus and other art movements that have treated language in unusual ways, and showing that this kind of participates in that same tradition.
Sam, how do your students approach your teaching?
Well, a few of my students are here right now. Hello.
You could acknowledge them.
But yeah, my students are wonderful thinkers and very game to cultivate that critical perspective. And grad media design is a very hybrid and interdisciplinary program. As a result, students tend to come from really different backgrounds in terms of study. I echo Allison, sort of teaching creative writing methods to people who don't have a background in literature or creative writing. Some do, but a great many don't. But I think there's also sort of an interesting tension between like creative labor and the way the industry works, in that, and part of sort of the reason for this hybridity of the program is to sort of work with that tension, but that having the ability to hone a critical perspective is a type of creative labor that's really valued, even if you don't end up using that in a particular job that you might get. So it becomes sort of tricky to navigate that. But it ends up leading to very productive discussion questions.
You know, it's interesting because you know, we deal a lot with you know, in the typographic world, we deal a lot with concrete poetry. And Allison and Sam, I'm sure you have an understanding about the concrete poets who looked at structure of language. And there's a similarity between, I think, between Allison, between what you're doing in terms of machine learning based poetry, and Sam, what you're doing between, you know, the reinterpretation of a visual communication movement. I mean, is there a way that the students can understand that the understanding of the structure of language and understanding the structure, the contextual structure of language, can really help them in their choices about developing product, let's say, which I think Allison touched on a bit. You know, everyone thinks that the machine is making these choices. And I think, Allison, you had a fabulous example when you said the machine sees this eclair differently than we see it. And I think that's one of the underlying issues in terms of machine learning, or understanding the translation from one medium to another. Sam, when you do a notation, a dance notation, you are looking at numbers and letters that represents something else. And how do you know if you're correct? How do you know if you're accurate?
Well, the answer
and how
is
do you
you don't. And you know, that's a reason why a lot of systems of dance notation have, even if they exist, you know, they haven't caught on in the way that maybe some of them hope to, which is to say they haven't been universalized, which generally I'm against. But knowing that you aren't going to get it right, and that the idea of trying to sort of account for every single aspect of what you're notating is not possible, right? Then you wouldn't have writing, you would just have the dance itself that you should just play again or perform again. And so choosing what to take with you and leave behind really becomes the question, leaning into knowing you're not going to do it correctly.
And that's and isn't that what the computer does in machine learning? It is making these decisions about what to include, what not to include, based upon, yes, the algorithms that, you know, you both put into your programming, in a sense, both are programs. But there is a definite left behind and included in the transcription of all of this. You know, it's, I find it interesting, Allison and Sam, that I don't understand why you have to say this was poetry by a machine. I think I almost want that to be dropped, that the explanation of a book that's been produced by a machine, to me, is interesting, because in itself it becomes an artifact of language, you know, and you don't need the clarification that it was a machine that did.
I don't add that clarification, right?
Neither do I.
I'm very careful to not attribute authorship to the computer or the machine at any point. That's extremely important to me. And sometimes I slip and use languages because that's the that's the way that people are often asked to talk about this stuff, is to attribute agency to the machine, but there's no agency there. It just does the thing that I tell it to do. There's materiality there, right? Like there are things that it's easier for the machine to do than other things. And that dictates the way that I use it as a tool to produce these different outputs. But like, you know, I would never put on my book, like, by Alison Parrish and Poetrytron 3000 or whatever.
And then, like, people have been writing sonnets for hundreds of years without attributing authorship to the form of the sonnet.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
And there's been appropriation and reattribution of language, of poetry, for centuries. I mean, we had that discussion too about, attribution and appropriation. So I find it very interesting that more and more the creativity of whether it's a pencil or whether it's a machine, it's still your creativity, Allison or Sam. I mean, it doesn't, just because the tool happens to be a machine and you've learned how to orchestrate. Basically, I look at both of the work that you do as orchestration. It's very much that you're conducting. And in a certain time in conducting language, there's a certain randomness. It changes every single time. You're not going to produce the same, orchestration every time you repeat perhaps the same piece, which I find very interesting, that there could be, there is a randomness that occurs in this. So people who always think that, machine learning or notation is always the same, I think that's a misnomer, that there is always change, there's always a randomness that's going to happen. Now I'm going to ask anyone if they have a question from the audience, perhaps if anyone has to have, oh, hi, Robbie.
Hello, I'm coming back in to help field the questions, and I actually wanted to start with a question that I have, which is, as you kind of navigate the space between art and design, and I think both MDP and ITP are really at this intersection between questions and solutions. How do you help students, and it's to expand upon the conversation that Gloria was bringing to the forefront, which is, how do you help them understand when to push back or when to reinvestigate a practical solution that they might come up with a more artistic or imaginative set of questions?
I mean, I tend to be very anti-solution in my classrooms. When that comes out, I try to shut it down. I think the logical endpoint of solution tends to be sort of like, like when Silicon Valley keeps sort of like accidentally reinventing public infrastructures that already exist, like the library or the bus, right? Instead, I try to sort of guide students toward making projects that ask the right questions, that don't think they have an answer, but are trying to work with something that maybe they feel ambivalent about, or maybe doesn't have a clear answer.
Yeah, I know this isn't the answer that you want, Robbie, but like I don't see there as being I don't agree with this taxonomy that artistic and practical are different and opposed to each other. I also find myself at the intersection of these different fields like machine learning, computer programming, which have traditionally been valued purely for their ability to produce solutions to problems, right? That aspect of those practices brings me no joy whatsoever, right? Like I find it to be just not good. So one of the things that I have to instill in my students is like, I know that you think you're taking this class so that you can learn how to program and get a job. And that's fine if that's something that happens sort of as like a side effect. But what I'm here to show you is that these practices, the practice of computer programming in particular, can just be useless. Like it can just be something that you do because it's beautiful and it's fun and it doesn't lead you anywhere, and it doesn't like produce an artifact that becomes like an investment mechanism, right? Like it doesn't give you the hockey stick of growth, and you don't go in front of Paul Graham and say, give me $50 million so that I can keep making computer programs. It's just something that you do because it produces joy and fun and just useless stuff, right? That to me feels like a radical thing to do in this circumstance.
So
No, I appreciate that, and it's not to create the binary between the two, but that there's so much tension that comes from solution-oriented activity in design and creative education, and I so appreciate the perspective to push back when possible and to reinvestigate, and I. Yes, and that's my personal feeling. Anyway, we do have two questions. So from Kate, and Kate, I'll just read this out. I really appreciate the distinctions being drawn between materiality and agency. I'm wondering about what mythologizing has to do with this too. Why does a machine offer mythologies of agency, whereas a pencil doesn't? Do you think that that has to do with materiality as well?
I've been actually really struggling with this question, and or with this issue, not with this particular question, but like this issue in general. The question itself is very well worded, very cogent. I'm not struggling with that at all. Because I wonder, like, is there something inherent about a computer program that produces fascism? Right. And it seems like that could be the case, right? Like, IBM made the demographic tracking tools for the Nazis, right? And now we have Facebook spreading authoritarian propaganda. Is there something inherent about the computer as an artifact, or the algorithm as an artifact that produces that kind of outcome? Or is it just like, the political and economic situation right now tends to make use of these things to produce those kinds of outcomes. And I don't know how to answer that. I think that computing has this property that it's possible, like it has these affordances for attributing agency to it that maybe other kinds of tools don't. Right? Like it appears to move on its own. It appears to come to conclusions. It appears to think in ways that Hammer doesn't, but ways that, like, other things do have those properties that aren't computers. You could think about like a slide rule or something like that, right? Or a Volvel or a table of logarithms. Like all of these things have some of those similar properties and have in the past had that kind of agency attributed to them. So I think it's a combination of those things. Like Google really wants to mythologize machine learning systems as having agency, to scrub their own agency from that process and make it seem objective. And it just happens to be this technology that has these properties of making it easy to attribute agency to it, that a pencil doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a neat answer to this excellent question as well. But I tend to think that both material and immaterial things get equally mythologized, right? Like the tools develop their own mythology, but on the other hand, and this is something that poetry and dance both have in common, that they, like the ephemerality of the live performance becomes mythologized, or poetry as the thing that can account for all those unexplainable things, or all of those interstices that can't be quantified, also sort of gets mythologized.
Right. That's an interesting thing.
That is very true. Another question?
Yes, so from Sihi, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, do you find resistance in the process of going against the norm of what's set in place by big tech? And then how can young designers push against that in such situations? Where do you find that pressure in asking those questions about authorship or autonomy or identity with regards to?
Yeah, I think the question is also, and you can answer this, is first you have to recognize that you should be asking these questions. I think that's very important. There's a process that we take what we're given, especially in a larger company or in a Google, that we make certain assumptions about what they're asking us to do. is okay. And as Allison, I think you can, expand on this, and Sam too, that the idea is always ask the question of what you're being asked to do.
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to this question.
Yeah, I just,
and I can only my background is in software engineering. I've never worked as a designer, so I can't really speak to that issue in particular, but and I'm also speaking from a position of privilege as someone who is no longer responsible in the professional world. Now most of my support network is in academia, which has its own problems, which overlap to a great degree. But it's hard to make an argument to a young designer that's oh, you should turn down that job, or you should mouth off to your supervisor or something like that, when there can be so much on the line with those decisions. And I can sit in this rectangle where I am and say bold things about computer programming being useless, but that doesn't help the graduate of my program who's just getting her first programming job, right? And needs for the programming to not be useless so that it has value, and then she can exchange that value for rent. So yeah, I wish I knew the answer. If I knew the answer to this question, then I would be able to get to sleep at night and wake up in the morning.
Great. I think, believe it or not, we have come to the end of our hour so quickly. Robbie, amazing that it happened so quickly. I can't believe it. Allison and Sam, I wish we had more time. I wish we really did have more time to go into depth a little bit more about a subject matter I think a lot of art and design students don't really address. But I know it's so important that they address it, in the future as we move on from here, and in the importance of how our language systems are changing, our visual language systems are changing, the concept of context, of syntax, of artifacts, what we keep, what we don't keep. But I want to thank you so much, both of you, and invite you again. I'll invite you again, Allison, to perhaps come to ArtCenter. Come to ArtCenter and do a workshop, perhaps in our graduate media studies program. I think they would definitely benefit, and we can put something together. But thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow at the next CAPTCHA program for creative technologies, when Jennifer 8 Lee will be here with Robbie talking about, of course, emojis and alternative forms of communication. I know it's very different. I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun. But thank you again. Thank you all for attending. And we'll see you again tomorrow.